All right. Hello and welcome everyone to the Climate and Energy webinar as part of our Common Agenda education series. My name is Lillian Anderson and I'm the Clean Energy and Climate Justice Policy and Campaigns Manager at Virginia Conservation Network. And we are the partnership of over 170 environmental organizations working across Virginia. Recently, VCN published our 2025 Common Agenda briefing book, an educational resource created by our partnership. Papers in the briefing book lay out our current environmental policy in Virginia and opportunities in clean water and flood resilience, land and wildlife conservation, land use and transportation, climate and energy, and good governance. With the publishing of our 2025 Common Agenda briefing book, VCN leads an annual webinar series throughout the fall called our Common Agenda Education Series. And this education series serves to educate environmental organizations, legislative and administrative staff, and the general public. So for this webinar today, we're going to be focusing on a few key or emerging issues in the climate and clean energy space. So before we continue, we'll be meeting today's webinar speakers. Today's speakers are Bob Shippee, the Legislative Chair at the Virginia chapter of the Sierra Club, Cheri Conca, Conservation Program Coordinator at the Virginia chapter of the Sierra Club, Emma Clancy, Staff Attorney at Southern Environmental Law Center, and Patrick Fanning, Virginia Staff Attorney at Chesapeake Bay Foundation. These partners will be presenting on the following topics today: data centers and energy demand, transportation electrification, distributed energy resources, and deploying large-scale solar while protecting our natural resources. As our speakers are presenting, if you have any questions, we ask that you submit them using our Q&A feature accessible at the bottom of your screen. We'll be answering questions during our Q&A portion in the second half of the webinar. So to start us off, we'll have Bob get us started. And Jaime, would you mind sharing the slides?
Yep. Thanks, Lillian. Thanks, Jaime. Good afternoon, folks. So the first topic for today is around data centers and how we can manage the growth here in Virginia. They are here. More are coming. A little bit about myself, if you don't know me, I am the legislative chair of the Virginia Sierra Club. I work on these and other issues throughout the year. If you have not been living under a rock, you probably know about this issue. It has mushroomed really in the last couple of years, largely because of the growth of our use of high-intensity internet, artificial intelligence. These are very, very data-intensive applications. And thank you, Jaime. So there's your topic. There's me. Oh, by the way, as you can see on that intro slide, the common agenda content for this topic and many of the comments that I'll make today really were pulled together by a dream team of folks from all different organizations. You see Piedmont Environmental Council, Southern Environmental Law Center, Chesapeake Climate Action Network, National Parks folks, Sierra Club. It's a lot of us are working on this issue for reasons that you'll understand in a moment. But anyway, so huge demand in bandwidth and in data storage and video content. All these things drive demand. It takes a lot of resources to fuel that. If you don't know, these data centers, as you'll see in that first bullet point there, the data centers are getting larger. So we're getting more of them, and they are larger in nature. So one hyperscale data center can consume 100 megawatts of power just by that one center. That is like a moderate-sized town of 80,000 homes. So these are serious development challenges, really, for our infrastructure. You are seeing utilities, in particular Dominion, but not only that, as we'll see here, citing this growth in demand as the biggest driver of the need for more generation of all kinds of energy. And now including, as you see from Dominion's latest integrated resource plan, you see not only renewables, which of course we all like, but also more fossil fuels and these small nuclear reactors that seem to be the rage these days. Already, data centers are over 20% of the Dominion energy load, and the company has been predicting their peak demand to double just in the next 14 or 15 years. You do see data centers spreading throughout the Commonwealth now. So it's not only a Dominion problem. There's a large hub that's planned in Southwest Virginia. You name the county, there's probably a project that's being discussed. You see these last two bullet points, I just want to call them out because there are significant air quality problems and water challenges and even land use issues that come up from these projects. We'll focus today primarily on the energy side of it, but this is a multifaceted issue, and that's a big reason why there's folks from so many organizations that are working on it. It really kind of touches on many of the issues that are important to most of the people on this call. So I'll go on to the next slide, which kind of lays out where we are today in Virginia. Virginia is really a unique state in the country in many ways. If you don't know this, there is a huge subsea cable that comes into the United States through Virginia Beach, and that carries data to and from Europe, to and from South America and other places around the globe. And that positions Virginia as a very unique location for data centers to grow and thrive. Also, Virginia was one of the first states to implement tax exemptions from sales and use taxes. That's a big deal for these companies because they are talking about many millions of dollars of equipment and other item machinery that would be taxable. So that makes a very large difference for corporate profitability. And then, of course, at the county level, you have numerous counties, including the one where I live in Henrico, that have cut local taxes and have provided incentives for data centers to locate in their municipalities. So financially, it's very attractive. Logistically, it's unique with sort of the infrastructure there, and electricity in Virginia is relatively cheap compared to some states, especially you and I maybe pay on a residential basis sort of average, but for corporate electricity, the utilities will cut pretty favorable deals. So all of that put together really makes Virginia the place to come. And we see it with the huge concentration in Northern Virginia. I've listed sort of the data center alley counties there. I'm sure you've probably seen the statistic that Ashburn, Virginia, carries 70% of the entire world's internet traffic through its lines. It really is mind-boggling. It's hard to get your head around. Data centers, I kind of alluded to this, they're now proliferating all across Virginia. You've got projects. I've listed some of the counties there. You could list almost every county at this point: Louisa, Henrico, Hanover, Spotsylvania, you name it. They're running out of room in Northern Virginia, and they're spreading. We won't talk much about legislation here, but some of you may know that because it is an important issue, there have been proposals made. They didn't really move through this 2024 session, in part because of the last bullet point you see here. The Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission, JLARC, is taking this important issue on. They're doing a study of it. They do plan to release the results of that study in December. That is sure to inform future proposals. It's just the type of issue that needs quite a broad analysis at the state level. I will note before we move to the next slide that you also see currently some of these large data companies directly contracting with utilities to, put small nuclear facilities next to their data centers or other generation sort of adjacent to large mega sites that they are planning. And you've probably seen reports of Amazon and Google doing that in various locations in the country, but definitely here in Virginia as well. All right, we can move on to the opportunities. There are many. That's the good news. There's things that can be done here. You know, we know that data centers are going to continue to grow, but we can take a look at the local planning processes where these operations are sited. You know, I have personal experience with planning processes in my home county of Henrico, and I've kind of gone through that process where we've had data centers, and you know those ordinances and procedures that are used to cite any business, they're not really built to consider the larger ramifications around electricity usage, what are the grid impacts, and even the other issues that I mentioned earlier, air quality, land use. I think that really large projects probably could benefit from state review. And so I think that's one thing that you'll see a lot more attention given to, perhaps from the JLARC study as well. Relating to that, the SCC, State Corporation Commission, Virginia's Department of Energy, and others could, and I think perhaps are already thinking about tools to analyze and mitigate these broad impacts of data center growth. I mean, there are ratepayer impacts, there are equity impacts, if you want to think about it that way, where all this usage is kind of going to single purpose, and yet perhaps all of us are paying for it. We could look at tax incentives. Again, in the earlier slide, you have seen that that's one reason why they're locating in Virginia. Very, very favorable tax treatment. We take a look at that and see if that mode of taxing, that strategy is still in sync with other goals the state has around energy and resource management. Maybe it made sense some years ago to have that structure. Maybe it doesn't make as much sense now. I'll mention a couple other things before we move on here, because there's a lot of opportunities. I mean, you'll hear later today about demand management. There are ways to manage peak demand. There are lots of efficiency measures that could be taken. We don't have to just continue to build more generation to deal with this. We have levers around managing demand. Also, you can look at transmission. Virginia is one of many states that is just starting to look at enhancing grid technologies. You can get a lot more juice out of our existing transmission lines than we are today. That also, at least in some modest way, perhaps, will reduce the need for building more and more generation. So I'll kind of wrap up here on the top on a very large topic and a very small amount of time that we're giving to it here until your questions, that is. I think when you're focusing on energy and how much data centers are using, you've got, one of the biggest takeaways that I think I'd like you to carry with you from this is who is going to be paying for that energy. Is it the industry that's demanding it? Is it everyone? Today it's mostly everyone. Is there a way for industry to pay more of its fair share of the costs for this burgeoning industry? It's not going to go away. It's definitely growing. Let's just make sure that costs are being borne where they should. One little factoid that I'll close with here. There are about 500 data centers in Virginia today. About 150 of those, about 30% of those, are what we call hyperscale data centers. In that first slide, I said that's often soaking up 100 megawatts or more of power. That is more than a third of the entire world's hyperscale data centers. So it's a big issue. There are things that we can do about it, but I will wrap up my section now, and we can come back to your questions later on in the meeting. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Bob. And yes, as a reminder, if you have any questions, we'll be answering those at the end of the webinar. So please go ahead and put those in the Q&A box. And now I will toss it to Cheri to talk about transportation electrification.
Great. Thanks, Lillian. And thanks for bringing us together today. I'd also like to thank Lena Lewis, Victoria Higgins, and Garrett G. for their work on the Accelerating Transportation Electrification paper. As Transportation and Smart Growth Program Manager for the Sierra Club Virginia chapter, my first priority is taking cars off the road through better transit, improved bike and pedestrian opportunities, and smart growth initiatives. But at the same time, we also need to rapidly transition away from harmful fossil fuel vehicles to cleaner electric vehicles. Why does a rapid transformation to electric transportation matter? Because we can't fight climate change without tackling the largest source of carbon dioxide in Virginia, and that's transportation. Transportation accounts for nearly half of Virginia's greenhouse gas emissions. A transition away from fossil fuel vehicles to cleaner battery electric models will not only reduce our CO2 emissions, but also other harmful tailpipe emissions such as methane, nitrous oxides, sulfur, and carbon monoxide. Imagine the health benefits of cleaner cars, buses, and trucks. There will be less episodes of asthma attacks and other respiratory illnesses, and heart conditions that are exacerbated by tailpipe pollution, especially in disadvantaged communities, which are often located along busy roadways. By the way, the graphic on the right shows what 1 metric ton of CO2 looks like. The average personal vehicle emits about 4.6 metric tons of CO2 per year. Cleaner vehicles will also save people money. The maintenance costs on EVs are much lower. There are fewer moving parts and no oil changes or spark plug replacement. Plus, EV drivers only spend about the equivalent of $1.28 per gallon for a full charge in Virginia. Consumer Reports estimates that owning an EV saves a typical driver $6,000 to $12,000 over the life of the vehicle compared to a similar gas-powered vehicle. Unfortunately, the benefits of EVs are not yet equally accessible to all Virginians. Local dealerships don't always have more affordable models available. People living in rural areas, multi-unit housing, and rental properties often have limited charging options. For both residents and visitors, a robust public charging infrastructure is needed, especially in rural areas. While most EV owners charge at home, Virginia is a geographically large state, and drivers need to feel confident that they can access public charging on long drives throughout the Commonwealth. The biggest blow to electrification of Virginia's personal vehicles happened this past June when Governor Youngkin announced that he plans to take illegal action by failing to update Virginia's existing advanced clean car standards to implement the Clean Cars 2 standards. If the governor's intended action is not blocked, Virginia will no longer follow advanced clean car standards beginning in January 2025. The bill to adopt clean car standards passed in 2021 and was upheld in the General Assembly in subsequent years when bills were introduced to repeal those standards. So what happens if we are no longer a clean car state? Well, each state is required to choose between following the advanced clean car standards or less stringent federal emission standards. No state is allowed to make up its own standards. And the reason advanced clean car standards are an option is because back in the 70s, California's air was so filthy that it was already developing emission standards by the time the EPA was created and developed its own standards. And then Virginia's legislature adopted clean car standards in 2021. And in 2022, California approved its updated version, which is called Advanced Clean Cars 2. Those Clean Cars 2 standards require 35% of new car sales to be electric, starting with 2026 models, and 100% of new cars to be electric by 2035. And there's been a lot of misinformation around this. Under clean cars, you would still be able to buy a used fossil fuel vehicle. Right now, we have about 17 states that are clean car states, and the market rewards those states. automakers prioritize sending EV models to states that follow clean car standards. That's why many Virginians had traveled out of state to buy EVs where they could find the models of their choice before clean car standards. Besides clean car standards, another factor shaping Virginia's EV landscape is charging infrastructure, particularly where gaps exist. This includes charging options for people living in multifamily dwellings and residents and visitors in our rural areas. You may have heard of the NEVI program, which stands for National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure. NEVI is a federal funding program that gives Virginia a good start to plugging gaps in our public charging infrastructure, but it's not enough. For instance, VDOT was awarded $11.3 million in NEVI funds in March to build charging stations along highways identified as alternative fuel corridors. The good news is that most of these sites are within a half-mile of federally designated disadvantaged communities. But that $11.3 million only buys us 18 charging stations throughout the Commonwealth. And although Virginia expects to invest $100 million in NEVI funds over the next 5 years, major gaps still exist in Virginia's public charging network, especially in rural areas. We need Commonwealth investment in rural EV infrastructure as well. One of the biggest barriers to EV adoption, if not the biggest barrier, is upfront costs. Even though the cost of an EV is cheaper than a fossil fuel vehicle over the lifetime of the vehicle, lowering the upfront cost would significantly encourage EV adoption. In 2021, the General Assembly passed a rebate to do just that, with significant investments targeted at low-income communities. Unfortunately, the rebate has repeatedly gone unfunded in the Commonwealth's budget, which is a shame because the structure of Virginia's program was applauded nationally. States that offer their own incentives to complement federal EV incentives see higher rates of EV adoption. And finally, let's touch on school buses. School buses are our largest transit system, so there's real value in electrifying them, especially to protect public health. Phasing out fossil fuel school buses will help protect the nearly 1 million Virginia students who ride the bus every day, reducing the number of asthma attacks and respiratory illnesses that they suffer. Virginia needs supportive state policy to leverage the time-limited federal funding for clean school buses. So what are our opportunities? Well, Virginia needs policies to support the transition to cleaner electric transportation, and policymakers play an essential role in ensuring that the transition is both fast and equitable and takes place first in communities that are most impacted by transportation pollution. There are many opportunities here, such as defeating the attempted squashing of Virginia's Advanced Clean Car Standards 2, which is one of the most successful clean cars laws. There are opportunities for smart planning and policies for grid reliability, including holding our utilities accountable for developing thorough transportation electrification plans that detail new investments, rates, and programs. And of course, funding our existing EV rebate program. Many clean cars and non-clean car states have implemented EV incentives because they have been shown to increase EV adoption. And rapid adoption is needed in order for us to reach our climate goals. To sum it up, our vehicles are a major source of pollution impacting climate, public health, and our economy. But a suite of complementary policies to support a rapid and equitable transition to electric transportation, including support for public charging infrastructure, funding for EV incentives and electric school buses, and planning for grid improvements are within reach. And if implemented, will help ensure that Virginia leads rather than lags in the transition to cleaner transportation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cheri. And again, if you have any questions on transportation electrification, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A box. And I will toss it to Emma to talk to us about distributed energy resources.
Thanks, Lillian. And as Lillian mentioned, I am a staff attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center. I joined the Virginia team this summer, but I've been working on these issues in South Carolina for more than 3 years, and I'm happy to be here. Give me a second to just share my screen. Okay, distributed energy resources. So distributed energy resources, or DERs, refer to a range of technologies that basically generate power close to where the power is being used, and they can play a really significant role in decarbonizing Virginia's power sector. And when we talk about DERs, I'm referring to things like rooftop, commercial, community, or shared solar, as well as smaller battery systems and demand response programs. And increasingly, as people talk about DERs, they're also talking about virtual power plants, or VPPs, which are essentially aggregated networks of DERs that utilities can call on in times during peak demand. So for instance, on a hot summer afternoon, a utility that has a VPP program might call on a bunch of home battery systems that are part of the program and use their capacity to meet periods of high demand. And so in that way, these aggregated DER systems can basically serve the same role that a gas peaker plant would traditionally serve. And the increasing availability of DERs really does mark a change in how we can think about utility systems. So it used to be that that building large, centralized fossil fuel power plants was really the only tool to meet growing load. But this centralized approach that revolves around one big plant really isn't necessary with the advent of DERs, which can be located strategically and can also target smaller scale reliability needs. One other benefit, or sort of interesting advantage, of DERs that I wanted to highlight is that they can be brought online very quickly, which makes them especially valuable in this climate where there is near-term and dramatic load growth. So just to provide a point of reference, VPPs can provide capacity in a matter of months, certainly less than a year, as opposed to solar and storage, which may take a few years, longer if there are interconnection queues, and fossil resources like gas will take even longer than those solar and storage resources, especially if they require a new gas supply. And I also, just continuing this theme, wanted to talk about some other benefits that DERs offer in addition to their sort of traditional carbon-free electricity. So DERs offer significant resilience benefits. So for example, during Hurricane Helene, some households in Western North Carolina that had solar and storage installations really became sort of de facto resilience hubs and a lifeline for communities that saw power outages for weeks. And so those resilience benefits are going to become even more valuable as we see more severe weather from climate change. And DERs can also provide transmission benefits. And so what I mean by that is that they can be strategically sited as an alternative to building new transmission lines. So for example, if there's a community that has poor reliability, one way to provide more reliable power to that community could be building a new transmission line or upgrading one, or as a potentially lower cost and less disruptive alternative, say a solar and storage installation could be placed sort of at that community's location to meet additional reliability needs. And that's often called a non-wires alternative or solution. So moving on to the current landscape, in 2020, the Virginia Clean Economy Act committed Virginia to powering the Commonwealth with 100% carbon-free electricity by 2050. And this law did require that investor-owned utilities, Dominion and APCO, meet 1% of their annual renewable portfolio standard requirement through DERs. Virginia also does have net metering, and it's currently provides customers who install solar systems on their property a full retail credit for electricity that they send back to the grid. And this arrangement, this rate structure for rooftop solar or net metering, is often referred to as one-to-one net metering. And it can typically be the most, it's more likely that installing solar will make economic sense for households when you have this type of structure. However, the State Corporation Commission is currently reevaluating the net metering structures for both Dominion and APCO. The APCO proceeding was opened this past fall, and the Dominion proceeding is expected to will be starting next year. And the outcome of these proceedings, the rate structures that the Commission ultimately approves, will really determine whether or not installing rooftop solar continues to be an economic proposition in Virginia. For example, if customers are only credited for power they send back to the system at a very low avoided cost rate, then they might not be able to save very much money on their utility bills. There is also, in addition to net metering, shared solar or community solar in Virginia. And in the 2024 legislative session, this was recently expanded. Specifically, Dominion shared solar was expanded to 350 megawatts, and a 50 megawatt program was created in APCO's territory. However, currently, for Dominion's shared solar program, the minimum bill is so large at $55 a month, which basically means that's the amount that customers have to pay every month, regardless of how much energy they're using. And Dominion's minimum bill has really limited participation. But fortunately, low-income customers are exempt from this charge and so have been able to participate in the shared solar program without this barrier. The Commission will also be reevaluating the minimum bill for each utility following the conclusion of the net metering proceedings that I just discussed. And as part of those proceedings, the Commission is required to look at costs and benefits of shared solar, and hopefully the legislation will result in an outcome that's fair to customers and incentivizes customers to sign up for these shared solar programs. And finally, I did just want to mention some persistent barriers that we do continue to see. Upfront costs for installing rooftop solar or batteries, continue to be a barrier. There have also been some instances of Dominion requiring, I think specifically some schools to pay for dark fiber as part of their interconnection costs. And this dark fiber interconnection is millions of dollars, just prohibitively expensive. I think fortunately Dominion was required to offer an alternative. So some projects have been able to pencil out, but that has been a barrier, and Dominion is expected to keep pushing on this dark fiber interconnection, which could increase costs for new DER projects. And moving on to opportunities. There were a lot of opportunities for DERs that came with the enactment of the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022. But one I wanted to highlight here is the EPA's Solar for All program, which set aside $7 billion for to make solar power more affordable and accessible for low-income households. And this past March, Virginia was awarded $156 million under that program. And the stakeholder process to finalize planning for how that money will be spent, I think, is expected to start this fall. And awards are expected in September of next year. And the hope really in the Solar for All program is that it can remove those upfront costs I mentioned so that solar is available to households that wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it. It also allows 20% of the funds for enabling upgrades, which basically means that a house that needs to get their roof fixed before they can install solar can use some of that solar for all money to allow them to make the fix to their house to get solar. And once those funds are out the door, I'm hopeful that it will, offer some replicable models for more communities to access solar. Another opportunity we see are as battery costs do decrease, pairing batteries and rooftop solar is a really exciting, increasingly available opportunity. Not only does it improve the resilience benefits of rooftop solar, but as I mentioned earlier, batteries can be aggregated into virtual power plants. So the utility can essentially call on battery systems participating in those programs during periods of peak demand. And while batteries are still expensive, some virtual power plant programs that utilities have been running offer upfront incentives to customers that sign up for those programs. So essentially the utility will give the customer money upfront to help with the cost to purchase a battery. In exchange, the utility will be able to call on that battery during periods of peak demand. And that's been deployed successfully in Vermont, and Duke in North Carolina just started running a pilot along those lines called the Power Pair pilot. I'll also just note that there are, a lot of these new apps can complement DER as well, like VPPs. They can be used to notify customers of opportunities to install storage or notify customers of, peak demand events. And apps have also been developed to speed up permitting for rooftop solar. So just improving the customer experience really matters with DERs, which are, sited at individual locations and homes. And finally, one other opportunity we see is expanding DERs in the built environment. So I believe there's a lot of desire to see more DERs on parking lots and to figure out how to best incentivize that. And to conclude, I will just restate that DERs can play a significant role in decarbonizing Virginia's power sector, while also improving grid resilience, lowering costs for individual households and the whole system, and offering near-term solutions to growing demand. And for all these reasons, we're really focused on policy and planning also that accounts for and supports DER growth. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Emma. And next up, we will have Emma again, joining Patrick Fanning from CBF to talk about deploying large-scale solar while protecting natural resources.
Give me 1 second and I'll share the next PowerPoint.
Okay, and while she's doing that, I'm trying to get my video on. Okay, there we go. Thank you, Lillian, and thank you, Emma, for joining me for this part of the presentation. I also just want to start by thanking my co-authors. There was a lot of really thoughtful discussion that went into this briefing book paper. Josephus Almond at the Southern Environmental Law Center, Peter Anderson at Appalachian Voices, and Ashish Kapoor at Piedmont Environmental Council helped write this paper on deploying large-scale solar while protecting our natural resources. So just briefly, why this matters, especially in the face of increasing demand, as Bob previously mentioned. It's more important than ever to increase our deployment of utility scale solar to not only meet this increasing demand, but also to address the need to transition from our existing fossil fuel infrastructure. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the landscape and the Virginia Clean Economy Act, but in a broader sense, not only is utility scale solar the cheapest form of new generation a form that's required to be deployed by the Virginia Clean Economy Act. It also has far fewer environmental impacts than existing fossil fuel generation. And so not only is it the right thing to do, it's the most affordable thing to do, and it limits those externalities or environmental impacts, especially in light of the fact that most of our existing fossil fuel generation, or even the proposed new fossil fuel generation, is in environmental justice communities that are already bearing a disproportionate burden of environmental impacts. So while we know that it's critical to deploy utility scale solar to meet our renewable energy goals and transition away from fossil fuels, we want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that's going to limit the impacts on Virginia's natural resources. Everyone has their own figure for how many acres per megawatt, but a general range of maybe 5 to 10 acres per megawatt is how many acres it takes to for utility scale solar to for 1 megawatt of energy. And so if you think about that on the type of generation that we need, it is a really significant land use impact. And so we want to make sure that we're deploying this utility scale solar in a way that limits impacts on our most productive agricultural and silvicultural lands, and instead focuses on where we can build out this utility scale solar on previously disturbed lands or brownfields, so that we're limiting impacts from things like erosion, sediment control, and stormwater and habitat loss. So this is definitely trying to strike a balance between moving as quickly as we can to get these utility scale solar facilities deployed, while also being really thoughtful about where we're placing them and how we're placing them. And I'll just mention that it won't be surprising for people to know that most of these facilities are going in very rural localities that may not have the resources or infrastructure or staff to make the most objective determinations about whether or not these facilities should be sited in their communities, and also how to make sure that they're protecting their landscapes from when these facilities are being deployed. So I'll flip it to Emma to talk a little bit about the current landscape.
Thanks, Patrick. Right, so the current landscape. So just to provide a bit more detail on some of the issues Patrick raised, the Virginia Clean Economy Act is driving solar development. It requires Dominion to propose 16,100 megawatts of onshore wind and solar by the end of 2035, and APCO must propose 600 megawatts of onshore wind and solar by the end of 2030. And just because of where onshore development is in the Southeast, it's likely that most of these targets will need to be met through solar. The VCEA also requires that beginning in 2025, at least 75% of these targets have to be met from resources located in the state. And it requires that at least 200 megawatts of the 16,000 megawatts in the Dominion target be placed on previously developed project sites. Now, currently, DEQ has also proposed some regulations that would minimize the environmental impacts from utility scale solar construction that Patrick mentioned. And so these regulations would require mitigation for impacts to prime agricultural soils and forest lands, and would also, and the goal would be to incentivize developers to use less disturbing construction practices, and also to incorporate different types of agrivoltaics, which can help sort of maintain the character of the community where utility scale solar projects are sited. And the hope in these DEQ regulations is really that that better practices can prevent more of the backlash against solar projects that has taken a hold in localities throughout Virginia. So, in the past few years, since the VCA was enacted, growing local opposition to solar has been fueled by misinformation campaigns talking about, solar leaching poison into the ground, which is not true. And also some early pioneer projects that employed really disruptive and inadequate construction practices and just left a bad taste in a lot of localities' mouth. Now, as a result of that sort of growing opposition, there have been an increasing number of restrictive local ordinances throughout Virginia that severely limit and in some cases ban the development of utility scale solar. Sometimes in areas that might actually be ideal spots for utility scale solar. And as these local bans become more pervasive, they really have the potential to threaten the state's abilities to meet the VCEA's goals, especially as we approach the requirement beginning in 2025 that 75% of Dominion's RPS requirements be met through resources in the Commonwealth. This becomes a real concern. And also with the significant load growth we're seeing in Virginia, it's becoming even more important to get clean energy online quickly. As I mentioned earlier, solar can come online faster than typical gas resources, which is an advantage for near-term load growth. But if we can't actually get clean energy online, then that will open the door to new fossil resource development. And with that, I will pass it back to Patrick.
Thanks, Emma. So some opportunities that we see to address the concerns in the current landscape and move us towards deploying more utility scale solar faster. A lot of emphasis is on the local government level where these projects are considered and approved from a zoning and land use perspective. So really we see an opportunity to empower these localities to make sure that they have the information that they need to make objective decisions about siting these projects in their communities. So whether that's providing more resources and technical assistance at the local level, where in some rural localities you might have one full-time employee or one half of a full-time employee trying to manage multiple proposals for utility scale solar, or if it's looking at more of a regional level with Virginia's planning district commissions to provide the resources so that projects are being considered on their merits. We're dispelling some of the misinformation that has been circulated in the past, and also addressing some of the concerns with some of the early utility scale solar projects that may not be the best identification of what the projects that are coming to these communities are going to look like now. At the same time, we want to make sure that when projects are approved by localities, that they're being built in a way that is thoughtful in terms of minimizing the impacts on our natural resources. So ways to do that, some of which are currently a part of our Virginia Department of Environmental Quality permit by rule process, are opportunities to minimize the amount of grading that developers are doing on their sites. There are relatively new technologies that have trackers for the panels that allow for them to be built on land that sort of rolls or undulates, so that you don't have to have the perfect slope and surface for siting these solar panels. And also minimizing the removal of topsoil. That's really critical to making sure that not only can you return these properties to some sort of beneficial use after the life of the utility scale solar project, but also so that they may be prime candidates for agrivoltaics, which, as Emma mentioned, is having some sort of agricultural activity, whether it's sheep or goats or bees that can be done concurrently with the energy production from utility scale solar. And then another focus area is making sure that we're creating the right incentives to encourage deployment of utility scale solar on previously disturbed lands. So whether that's existing brownfield sites, there are some pilot projects deploying utility scale solar on formerly mined sites, and there's an existing fund, the Brownfield and Coal Mine Grant Fund, that has been stood up by the General Assembly, but not yet capitalized. And just finding the sweet spot of what sort of incentives are necessary to get developers to focus on these previously disturbed lands, whereas it might be cheaper and more convenient to go after green fields. What's the right mix of incentives to get more deployment on these prior disturbed lands? And I think we'll close it out now.
Yeah, I think just wanted to conclude with the takeaway, reiterating that, you know, there will be we will need some utility scale solar development on greenfields to meet some of these targets, but we should continue to try to minimize environmental impacts for those projects, use agrivoltaics, and try to site these projects on the built environment to the greatest extent possible. And I think that's that.
Thank you, Emma and Patrick. And thank you to all of our speakers for sharing their insights on these various topics. We are going to transition to the Q&A portion of the webinar. So again, we ask that you submit questions in the Q&A chat box so that we can share them with our speakers. And we will take as many questions as possible in the allotted time today. So we've got a couple questions that have rolled in about data centers. So Bob, these two are for you. Let's start with the first question of, do we know anything about how often data centers use diesel generators?
Yeah, so I know of recent projects. These diesel generators are meant to be backup generators. They're not meant to run other than when there's some kind of emergency or perhaps peak demand issue. And that's fairly rare, at least in the data centers that I've personally looked at. So in those situations, they're just running monthly to test the generators. The manufacturers require, I'm told, monthly testing of the equipment. So at a minimum, that's what you've got. There could be some data centers in Virginia that run them more frequently than that, but that's not what they're meant for. So that's kind of my answer for that. They're very polluting. They're very loud when they are running. So I think for a lot of reasons they don't try to run them very often. So it's meant for backup power only.
Thank you, Bob.
Lillian, can I chime in on this as
Yeah,
well?
please.
Just to educate folks. So not this summer, but 2023 summer, there was a proposal from the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality to allow some data centers in Northern Virginia to operate their backup generators due to a shortage of energy supply. And the environmental community was successful in opposing that proposal from DEQ to allow those generators to serve for anything other than sort of the emergency backup support that Bob mentioned.
Thanks, Patrick. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick and Bob. And the next data center related question is, can Virginia put curbs or disincentives on blockchain technology and cryptocurrency mining?
Yeah, so this is an interesting topic. Could Virginia do that? Yes, I think Virginia could. I don't know that that's going to be proposed. Frankly, I think there's a lot of folks across kind of the political spectrum that like or dislike this technology. And I do think some states are taking a look at that, but I don't really expect Virginia to move in that direction. But of course, that proposal is feasible. I just don't see it, having a lot of legs right now.
Thank you, Bob. All right, those are all the data center questions I'm seeing. So now we'll transition over to vehicle electrification. And let's start with, Cheri, this question is for you. Are there any initiatives to require large apartment buildings or condos to have EV charging capabilities?
We have a right to charge bill that passed in 2020, and that prevents multifamily dwelling owners and operators from prohibiting EV charger installation unless they explicitly specify they're prohibited in their documents. So that's a big loophole, and that is something that needs to be fixed. That law needs to be strengthened.
Thank you, Cheri. And then this next question is also about EV charging. The question is, why is it a taxpayer obligation to build EV charging stations? Why not let the private sector build charging stations as they're doing now and spend public funds elsewhere?
That's a really good question. I think that reducing carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is pivotal. The Commonwealth investment in EVs is desirable because we're trying to clean up our air rather than pollute it as fossil fuel vehicles do. And we could let the private sector build charging stations, but then they deserve the same state incentives just as other industries do. Barge and rail transport, infrastructure for industrial and commercial projects, they all get incentives from the state. And EVs not only benefit our economy, but also our climate and health. And reducing CO2 helps protect our natural assets, such as forests, which also have significant health and monetary value. So that's why I think it's valuable for the state to incentivize. Also, even non-clean car states offer EV incentives, such as Kansas, which they realize how beneficial EVs are to their health and economy.
Thank you, Cheri. And then I have one more question for you. This one's about railroad electrification. How can advocates work to advance railroad electrification in addition to vehicle electrification? Railroad diesel locomotives operate tens of thousands of miles daily, so this is an important emissions target.
Yes, I think that is very valid. I think that we do have some really important EV rail advocates in the state, including Mr. Foster, who gave the question. So we appreciate all his work around that. I think the reason we focus on personal vehicles is that overall in the transportation sector, 71% of our transportation CO2 emissions come from road users, whereas only an average of 1.8% comes from rail. And I think the max that they estimate in Virginia is 3% from rail. So that's why we focus more on personal vehicles.
Thank you, Cheri. And now I have a question for Emma regarding distributed energy resources. How can we encourage solar carports to add more solar installations and take advantage of large existing parking lots? And Patrick, feel free to chime in here as well if you would like to.
Yeah, so it's a good question and a challenge. I think the most sort of the highest level answer is that legislation incentivizing siting on those in those built environments would probably be the most effective. But another important part of the equation for just small business owners or commercial customers is having favorable net metering rate structures. So in that sense, these upcoming state corporation commission proceedings will be important, not just to residential homes, but businesses in terms of how much what the economic sort of benefits they see from from investing in these solar installations will be to their business. So that's not a pretty high level answer, but definitely something to dig into. I don't know if anyone has anything to add, but.
And this question that came in the Q&A box is somewhat similar, so I'll toss it to Emma and Patrick if you feel you're able to answer it. The question is, are there specific efforts going on right now to incentivize utility scale solar, so talking large scale solar in the built environment? And how could advocacy and information sharing make a difference in that area?
I think there is. There are significant efforts by organizations like the Nature Conservancy. I will say, just as some background, there are a lot of solar developers that just as a rule will not touch developing on a brownfield site because it's so much more expensive, and the insurance costs and the complications can be so prohibitively expensive that it just does not work with the solar developers model. But there are some developers, I believe Sun Tribe in Charlottesville, that are really prioritizing how to develop brownfield sites, and I believe there are some efforts within the environmental community to expand incentives for developing on those sites. Patrick, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yep. So I'll just add, I mentioned it's called the Brownfield and Coal Mine Grant Fund that was set up, I think about 3 years ago, and it was initially set up to help incentivize deployment of utility scale solar, on brownfields or formerly developed sites. But initially it was limited to only pulling down federal funding, so no state appropriations could be utilized to put money into that fund. And we were successful in removing that prohibition on using state funds, but we were not successful, or at least have not been successful yet, in getting a state appropriation to that fund to get the money flowing, so that some of the developers that Emma mentioned who maybe are reluctant to consider prior developed sites to start thinking about it. So it's going to be a multi-step process, I think, to find the right mix of funding and limiting the liabilities that a developer would take on for siting on a previously developed site. And then I'll also say that the mitigation regulations that Emma mentioned for impacts to prime agricultural lands and forest lands are also meant to help improve siting. So we know that there will be significant deployment on greenfield sites, but can we avoid our most productive and pristine forest and agricultural lands in that process? So a little bit of a reverse incentive.
Thank you both. And then this is a clarifying question. Could you please define what a utility scale solar facility is? Is it defined by how much power it generates, and what is the typical acreage?
I don't know if there's a specific number. I think of utility scale as like probably greater than 5 megawatts. But when we think about, when we're looking at the utilities resource planning docket, we're thinking about solar projects that may be 50 megawatts to 100 megawatts. And as far as acreage, as Patrick mentioned, it's the sort of rule of thumb is that for every 1 megawatt, a solar facility uses 5 to 10 acres. So if you took the upper limit and multiplied 10 by, say, a 50 megawatt facility, that could be 500 acres, which is a simplification, but helps to estimate.
Yeah, I think Emma hit the nail on the head. I think there are a couple different definitions floating around, but for instance, the DEQ permit by rule program, which is the program that most utility scale solar facilities choose to go through for permitting, that the minimum threshold for that is 5 megawatts or 10 acres. So I think it's anywhere from there on up.
Yeah, and I'll just say like sort of the 1 megawatt to 5 megawatt range is what we might see for a shared solar installation, where customers can subscribe to that.
Great. Thank you both. And this is the final question we have for today. Are there any environmental concerns about battery power storage facilities?
I'm not a battery engineer, but I'm happy to try to address this. As far as batteries being sited in homes for DER programs and virtual power plants, those battery technologies are very sophisticated. We recently worked with an expert who developed and helped to manage the Bring Your Own Battery VPP program for Green Mountain Power in Vermont. And in his whole time there were no fires or complications or anything, because there's a lot of levels of safety, and the fire departments in the areas where there are batteries are typically, schooled in how to deal with potential fires and to be ready to address any complications. As far as utility scale battery systems, those will be larger, but they're still not that large. So something that's really beneficial about batteries is that they are very scalable and can be sited wherever it makes the most sense, often, where there's transmission. So under the Inflation Reduction Act, batteries can get an additional tax credit, basically, for siting where there are old coal plants, basically. So you can kind of just fit them in where there is development. And so that definitely reduces the environmental impact, because the siting can be so flexible and can easily be placed on the built environment where there often is this transmission hookup. And I think people often raise like battery decommissioning and solar decommissioning concerns, which of course can seem overwhelming, I think, because they just haven't been around long enough to be decommissioned at a large scale. But from what I've heard, batteries actually, they're sort of made up of multiple cells. So as a cell fails, that cell can be replaced, and it sort of can be an iterative replacement process. So that's a very high level answer, but just to emphasize that that yes, we think they do provide significant benefits, especially when you look at them offsetting gas plants or any new fossil plants. And I'll also just note that, we don't have that many batteries in the Southeast, but in Texas, there's about 3 gigawatts. In California, there are even more. They're not an emerging lithium batteries are not an emerging technology. They are proven at high scales. So that's what I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. The only thing that I would add there is we are seeing more and more of the utility scale solar projects that are being proposed are partnered with a battery storage component to help, provide more consistent energy. And there is an opportunity, as I mentioned, a lot of these utility scale solar facilities are being sited in rural communities, and the solar developer will enter into a siting agreement with the locality. And often in those siting agreements, they will make sure that there are resources in place for the local fire department in the case of, any type of emergency, as uncommon as that maybe. That's one way that they're make sure there are protections in place for that unlikely event.
Great, thank you both. And again, thank you to all of our speakers for providing your expertise and your insight in today's webinar. If any of our attendees have follow-up questions or would like to reach out, we've attached the presenter emails at the bottom of this slide. And at this point, I'm going to pass it to Jaime, VCN's Communications and Trainings Associate, to share some resources and information about upcoming events.
Thanks, Lillian. Now that you've gotten to learn about a few of the key or emerging issues facing Virginia, what's next? I'd like to highlight our upcoming General Assembly preview. Our General Assembly preview serves to educate environmental advocates across the Commonwealth about critical environmental legislative action upcoming in the 2025 General Assembly. This year, it'll take place on Saturday, December 7th from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. with regional watch parties across the Commonwealth, and with both in-person and virtual options. This is your best chance to hear from statewide experts, meet other conservationists in your area, and learn how to get more involved on the local level, all in one day. We'll be announcing the locations of these regional watch parties in the next few weeks, so please stay tuned. I'd also like to highlight our General Assembly Advocacy 101 webpage. This webpage is a great resource for environmental advocates on how to strengthen your environmental advocacy. This webpage highlights upcoming events and actions, videos and guides, and an overall FAQ section on how to prepare for Virginia's General Assembly process. Here you can also find our General Assembly 101 training videos, which provide insight on various General Assembly related topics, such as the basics of the General Assembly, citizen lobbying, and more. We also have a General Assembly advocacy guide, which provides an overview of Virginia's legislative session for advocates. This QR code will redirect you to our General Assembly Advocacy 101 webpage. We suggest that you bookmark or save this resource somewhere, as it'll be a helpful resource in the months to come. With that being said, this concludes our climate and energy webinar as part of our Common Agenda education series. I'd like to thank our speakers once again, Bob, Cheri, Emma, and Patrick, for speaking today and going into depth into some of the key issues facing our Commonwealth. As a reminder, the recording of this webinar will be shared in the next few days with registered attendees. Looking forward, our next webinar will take place next Wednesday, October 30th from 12 to 1:30 p.m. regarding the key or emerging issues from the Land and Wildlife Conservation chapter of our 2025 Common Agenda. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.